Everybody firmly believed she had vanished completely. Following November 2024, passing her official admission of defeat and her muted withdrawal from civilian engagement, the political establishment reached a unified conclusion that Kamala Harris was entirely done. She had suffered a defeat to Trump. She had unsuccessfully attempted to retain control of the executive branch. According to Washington's fiercely pragmatic standards, she was simply old news. Trump's campaign staff stated this perspective freely. His political friends openly ridiculed her lack of public commentary. His representatives labeled her completely inconsequential. Moreover, for several consecutive months, it genuinely appeared as though they were correct. Suddenly, an event unfolded that absolutely no one anticipated. She made a return, and she certainly did not do so peacefully. This is the primary fact you must comprehend before anything else. Kamala Harris did not merely emerge from the shadows. She returned armed with undeniable proof. She stepped back onto the scene holding a figurative dossier of evidence. Furthermore, that specific dossier detailed the initial 3 months of Donald Trump's subsequent term. Every single forecast she delivered throughout the 2024 campaign trail, every caution she voiced that journalists labeled overblown, and every red flag she hoisted that his own base dismissed as alarmist behavior were all resting right there as validated facts. She confidently re-entered the civic arena fully aware of the exact ammunition she possessed. The pivotal instance that altered the entire landscape took place on April 30th, 2025, inside the Palace Hotel located in San Francisco, during a formal banquet celebrating an advocacy group dedicated to launching Democratic women into government roles. The venue was packed to capacity, the media lenses were primed, and the moment Kamala Harris approached the podium, a palpable shift occurred instantly in the room's energy because this was absolutely not the guarded and meticulously handled Harris from the election cycle. This presented a leader who had devoted months to observing, biding her time, and strategizing. In addition, she possessed a highly specific message to deliver. She initiated her remarks with a statement that completely silenced the audience. She proclaimed that rather than an executive branch striving to promote America's noblest principles, citizens are currently observing the complete discarding of those exact values. That initial declaration served only as the starting point. What ensued was a 15-minute sequence featuring the most exacting, disciplined, and clinical political dismantling that anyone present had observed in recent memory. It was neither overly passionate nor disorganized, but rather sharp and calculated, resembling an individual who had preserved this specific address for the perfect occasion. Additionally, here is the exact factor that distinguished it from every other speech of political resistance. She was absolutely not making assumptions. She was definitely not dealing in hypotheticals. She was simply reciting the current metrics. Trump's initial 100 days had resulted in a national fiscal shrinkage of precisely 0.3%. Financial exchanges were plummeting rapidly, while import taxes were sparking what fiscal analysts were already dubbing early indicators of a severe downturn. Furthermore, Harris remained stationed at that podium and articulated exactly what she had forecasted would transpire, nearly verbatim. She described it as the most severe, artificially created financial disaster in contemporary executive history. Her prior statements and her initial warnings were now serving as her ultimate vindication. However, the focus was not solely restricted to the financial sector. That alone would have proven completely sufficient. That singular focus would have constituted a highly impactful address entirely on its own merit. She pushed the boundaries much further. She brought up a topic that absolutely nobody within the Democratic faction had possessed the courage to vocalize with such distinct directness. She explicitly utilized the phrase constitutional crisis, not as an embellished talking point or a catchy campaign phrase, but rather as a rigorous judicial and operational breakdown of the events she was observing unfold live. This included the judicial branch facing blatant disregard, the legislative branch facing total circumvention, and presidential power stretching far past any established norm in recent national history. She presented this breakdown with extreme logic, and upon her conclusion, the audience recognized that a fundamental pivot had just occurred. Here lies the crucial detail that traditional media outlets overlooked entirely. The address was not exclusively focused on criticizing Trump. It centered around a specific forecast she delivered during the election season that the general public had largely brushed aside. Review the historical video recordings, revisit the exact words she spoke during the closing weeks preceding the national vote. She labeled Trump as a mere conduit rather than the primary builder or the strategic genius, describing him as a tool utilized for the rapid execution of a political playbook that had been decades in the planning phase. Back then, electoral commentators dismissed that characterization as excessively theoretical, highly academic, and overly simplistic as a method of criticism. Presently, observe the actual events taking place since the 20th of January. Every single directive is being deployed exactly as the Heritage Foundation's strategic document outlined. This encompasses the tearing down of the National Education Agency, the push for widespread privatization, and the tax codes facing total restructuring to overwhelmingly favor the ultra-rich. She was not fabricating any of these claims. She was literally reading directly from the established strategy. Subsequently, the events in Las Vegas unfolded. Furthermore, this marks the exact moment where the narrative becomes truly volatile. Exactly a week following the San Francisco address, Harris attended a gathering of Nevada Democrats. It featured a more intimate setting, a relaxed atmosphere, and an entirely distinct vibe. This shift occurred because by May 7, 2025, the American government was actively engaging military forces in Iran, an offensive that lawmakers had never sanctioned, which Harris perceived as a careless, costly endeavor fueled by precisely the type of erratic presidential overreach she had cautioned against for countless years. She commenced her commentary with distinct caution. She attempted to remain steady, and then an individual in the crowd yelled for her to speak her mind. Consequently, Kamala Harris obliged the request. She declared that the entire situation was complete nonsense. The gathering space completely erupted in response. She reined in her emotions almost instantly. She let out a brief chuckle. She stated that the crowd forced her into doing that, noting she had sworn off using profanity in open settings. Nevertheless, the statement was officially out there, and it circulated globally in a matter of moments. Currently, here is the specific aspect concerning the media coverage of that instance that reporters continually misunderstood. The general public concentrated entirely on the explicit language. Absolutely no one paid attention to the context situated immediately prior to that remark. Harris had just systematically detailed how the American government was wasting billions of dollars on an unapproved combat mission, while domestic households were observing fuel costs surge, pension funds dwindle, and employment stability disappear. She had just successfully linked every individual piece of that data directly back to the policy choices originating from the Oval Office. The aggravation present inside that venue was absolutely not a theatrical display. It did not constitute manufactured political drama. It represented the specific brand of unfiltered, genuine fury that emerges when an individual has been factually correct regarding a critical issue for an extended period while remaining entirely ignored. That is precisely the sentiment the audience was reacting toward. The profanity merely served as the superficial layer. The actual material resting beneath it functioned as a rigorous indictment. However, this is precisely the juncture where the narrative experiences a pivot that completely alters the underlying context. This occurred because while Harris was re-emerging and shifting to an aggressive posture, an entirely separate event was transpiring concurrently. It was an action that the Trump team seemingly trusted would mute her voice, or at the very least demonstrate to her the consequences of resisting too aggressively. The specialized federal security detail that had been prolonged for Kamala Harris well past the customary 6-month duration was abruptly canceled. Trump dispatched a singular correspondence to the Department of Homeland Security. It contained a solitary sentence mandating the termination of the protective protocols for Kamala D. Harris, taking effect on the 1st of September. There was zero dialogue, zero advance notice, and zero transparent justification. It was merely a written directive. The chief executive of Los Angeles labeled it with absolute bluntness. He declared this constituted an additional measure of vengeance, following an extensive catalog of partisan reprisals. Governor Newsom's administration echoed the exact same sentiment. The physical protection of a former American vice president was yanked away via presidential decree, precisely while a nationwide literature tour was slated to commence the subsequent month. Consider deeply what this action essentially communicates to you. It is not fundamentally about the judicial technicalities of the decision. It is not regarding the governmental discourse surrounding the security teams assigned to past leaders. Contemplate the calculated warning it was designed to broadcast. Kamala Harris was stepping back into the limelight. She was actively delivering public addresses. She was generating significant friction. Consequently, a specific official concluded that the appropriate reaction was to force her to experience profound vulnerability. The goal was to show her exactly what happens when the total crushing force of presidential authority targets your specific existence. The tactic ultimately failed completely. It actually exacerbated the situation because the outcome it generated was precisely what any logical person would anticipate. Every liberal politician who had remained passive suddenly discovered a compelling cause to unite behind. Every centrist voter who had been secretly uneasy regarding the current administration's trajectory was handed an undeniable piece of evidence. Furthermore, Kamala Harris stepped into her subsequent public engagement possessing an asset she had lacked previously. She now held absolute moral certainty. It is the specific variety of certainty that exclusively arrives once you recognize that engaging in the conflict is no longer a voluntary choice. Moreover, that is exactly the moment the MSNBC conversation took place. She settled into the chair and deployed two specific words that sliced through the surrounding noise. She labeled it a vengeance campaign. She declared that Trump was manipulating the Department of Justice to serve as a private tool for retaliation, presenting this not as a vague theory but as concrete fact. She highlighted highly specific legal situations. This included the criminal charging of past FBI Director James Comey, the aggressive pursuit of New York Attorney General Letitia James, and the targeting of the exact same litigator who had devoted years to constructing the corporate fraud lawsuit against the Trump enterprise. She outlined the recurring theme utilizing the identical clinical exactness she had showcased in San Francisco. Additionally, she made a declaration that has continued reverberating ever since that exact moment. She stated that American citizens absolutely cannot rely on the Department of Justice. She emphasized that this mistrust is mandatory beneath the current presidential leadership. It is impossible to trust them when the clear trend regarding who faces prosecution and the reasons behind it continually point toward the exact same conclusion. Here lies the specific element that ought to genuinely force you to pause and reflect. This is true because a dynamic is unfolding within this narrative that extends far past a single past vice president delivering public remarks. There exists a massive forecasting issue, and its roots extend incredibly deep. Harris dedicated the whole of the 2024 campaign trail to alerting the electorate regarding a highly specific brand of presidential conduct. She cautioned that Trump would aggressively penalize his rivals. She cautioned that he would leverage federal authority to compensate obedience while simultaneously crushing any opposition. She cautioned that the judicial system would encounter coercion of a magnitude they had never previously endured. She cautioned that the financial frameworks currently being pledged would create widespread suffering instead of true wealth. She explicitly cautioned the public about every single aspect of it. During that period, the press organizations simply published truth-checking articles. Trump's loyalists branded her commentary as baseless, panic-inducing rhetoric. Electoral strategists claimed she was drastically exaggerating the severity of the situation. Currently, you should revisit and observe the exact forecasting clips that have been re-emerging across digital networks for consecutive months. Observe her precise commentary regarding military commanders, regarding absolute obedience evaluations, regarding the distinction between armed forces that protect the foundational laws versus troops that serve a single individual, and subsequently examine what has genuinely transpired inside the defense headquarters since the new year. The perfect synchronicity between her past forecasts and current reality is definitely not a random occurrence. It is absolutely not an instance of biased recall. It remains officially recorded. It carries a verified chronological marker. It exists permanently within the historical archives. This reality guides us toward the central inquiry that absolutely no one inside the governing elite wishes to address straightforwardly. What is the true implication when the individual who was destined for defeat, whom everyone pronounced entirely defeated, ultimately reveals herself to have served as the most precise electoral forecaster of the current era? And what occurs when quiet observation transforms into readiness, and readiness transforms into a foundation, and that foundation transforms into an entity that those holding authority are utterly unable to casually ignore or destroy? Kamala Harris absolutely did not return blindly launching attacks. She arrived equipped with hard statistics. She arrived holding a sequential chronology of events. She arrived bearing the documented text of her personal forecasts, directly comparing them against the lived reality that every single individual across America was actively enduring. Consequently, that specific blend, consisting of the historical archive paired with the hard evidence and the perfect timing, constitutes a force that no public relations tactic can completely counteract. The electoral sphere is eagerly observing to discover her subsequent maneuver. The gubernatorial contest in California is rapidly intensifying. The 2028 presidential nomination battle is currently being plotted by every single left-leaning consultant possessing a blank canvas. Furthermore, Kamala Harris is positioned precisely in the center of this entire dynamic, formulating choices that absolutely no one exterior to her trusted circle comprehensively grasps quite yet. Will she launch a campaign for the governorship? Will she bide her time for the national platform? Or will she persist in constructing influence from beyond the formal apparatus, leveraging the hard-earned respect of her validated forecasts as a bargaining chip inside a political faction that is frantically hunting for leadership while nobody possesses the answers? Moreover, that specific ambiguity serves inherently as a distinct manifestation of influence. However, here represents the exact reality we confidently understand. The resurgence was absolutely genuine. The resulting influence was easily quantifiable. The massive audiences that gathered in San Francisco, the palpable electricity inside the Las Vegas venue, and the rapid dissemination of those specific video segments across every digital network within mere hours, absolutely none of that phenomenon was artificially engineered. It served as the direct consequence of something deeply genuine. An individual who suffered a defeat remained silent, observed with intense focus, meticulously constructed an argument, and stepped confidently back into the spotlight only when that argument was fully primed. Furthermore, when the argument proves that robust, when the forecasts are completely authenticated, and when the historical text remains perfectly transparent, the core inquiry ceases to focus on whether the resurgence is legitimate, and instead the central issue shifts toward what unfolds in the immediate future. Additionally, at this exact moment, that specific inquiry lacks a clear resolution that anyone, including her supporters, her detractors, and undoubtedly the current leadership that attempted to mute her voice through a singular brief memo regarding protective services, is adequately equipped to handle. Keep a close eye on this developing situation because the events that transpired in San Francisco and Las Vegas did not represent the conclusion of a narrative arc. It served entirely as the initial maneuver within a sequence that is barely starting to form its structure. Finally, the subsequent maneuver is approaching much more rapidly than anyone currently anticipates.